And that is why globalization can't be simply brushed away as, it's inevitable. We have to just deal with it. It's the future. And those were the arguments being made in the 90s. One of my favorite journalists, who I have actually talked to numerous times, Thomas Friedman. Thomas Friedman on the Middle East is without peer. His book, From Beirut to Jerusalem, wow. It's 30 years old. Folks, it's worth looking at. If you want to understand Arab countries, Israel, 30 years later, so much of that is brilliant background. From Beirut to Jerusalem by Friedman. It's his best book. But Friedman made his money, he made his fame writing books about globalization. The Lexus and the Olive Tree. The World is Flat. Those were the things he wrote about. And Thomas Friedman correctly pointed out that we could not stop globalization. Companies were going to create production lines and move to other countries based on a huge labor pool, cheap labor, huge incentives being offered. And the profit margin was so large that American, German, European, Japanese companies all flocked to China. And it was clear the reason why. Because it was so much cheaper and because they saw it as a process that could make their bottom line so much larger. And they sold it to everyone by saying, look, consumer products are going to be a lot cheaper. When you go to the Target or you go to whatever store and something is made in China, it's not going to be that expensive. You're going to be amazed at how this is going to save money for American consumers. And folks, it spread everywhere. Again, many people thought, yes, as Thomas Friedman argued, it's inevitable. There's no turning back. But what we are seeing now is that, yes, there were many positives. I mean, China, India, the number of people in poverty around the world suddenly declined. I mean, it's amazing. But in those countries, they took advantage of the desire by American and European and Japanese companies to use their cheap labor. Today, what we're seeing is the explosion in the last 12 years of China's economy. And with COVID, it is simply, I think, exacerbated what had been building for years. And what had been building for years was anger. People were angry who were the ones being left out, who the rising tide was destroying. And that anger was building and building and not getting a great deal of attention. But that anger was palpable. And in 2000, this is what's so interesting. In 2000, Donald Trump ran for president. He ran for president in 2000. The Reform Party was his party. He lasted 3 months and then he quit. He was not a Republican. He didn't have any slogans. He thought, I'm going to come in as Reform Party. People will embrace no more Democrat or Republican. He wasn't really fine-tuned with his message. He hadn't figured out the populist phrases and themes to capture those disaffected, angry Americans. Let's fast forward 16 years. Suddenly, 2015, his campaign advisors are seeing, oh my God, it's a different ballgame because of globalization and the massive improvement in technology, Facebook, Instagram, all that came in 2007. Folks, social media really didn't start until 2007, 13 years ago. Miles was just a young tyke, causing Rabbi Alex enormous headaches, but that's okay. But that was only 13 years ago. It's 2007. The technology leapfrogged every year to the point where suddenly in 2015, you had Facebook play a major role suddenly, and in 2016, campaigns, Instagram. We didn't have the safeguards on globalization. And that's one thing I want to get into tonight. Globalization was embraced without safeguards. Again, the rising tide will lift all boats. We didn't look at the needed regulations. This is something that is a historic theme that keeps coming back over and over. When you have an economy booming in the United States without regulation, without restriction, hey, laissez-faire economics. We saw what it did in the 20s. We saw what it did under George W. Bush. We see what happens when the government simply says, no holds barred, no holds barred. And that was the case with globalization because too many countries were seeing the economic gains for a huge portion. They weren't looking at the negatives, or they thought the negatives, well, you know, people will find other work. Factories will close, mines might close. But that's not the future here in the US, in Japan, in Germany, in France, in the UK. And so what was building? Anger, disenchantment. People in all these countries who were on the bottom end were suddenly becoming more and more resentful. And suddenly they could start reaching each other via social media, via the internet. Hey, folks, there have been a lot of strange people in the weeds over the years. They've been over in the weeds. We haven't paid a lot of attention sometimes to the white supremacists, the anti-Semitic groups. They were nut jobs in the fields. And as long as we kept them there, everything would be fine. Well, Donald Trump has brought them out of the fields. They support him. They are a major part of his base. They helped to get him elected in razor-tight margins in Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania. By the way, this is an old joke, but I have to come back to it. The campaign manager, James Carville, Bill Clinton's campaign manager in 1992, he said, we've got to win Pennsylvania. And the secret to Pennsylvania is you've got Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, and Alabama in between. And that's Pennsylvania. I mean, I'm sorry, folks, but you drive 2.5 hours into the middle of the state and you hear the banjos play. And you see some crazy stuff. I mean, years ago, my students were looking at me. They said, Savarese, did you see the Confederate flags on a couple of these places we just drove by? I said, I was trying not to point that out, but absolutely. And Pennsylvania, all of these states suddenly had a voice, an opportunistic voice who I don't think really cared all that much about him, but it was a winning game plan. He was going to beat that drum. And Steve Bannon found a phrase that he could use over and over, despite the fact that he's a stable genius. He doesn't have the memory skills of perhaps some of the intellectuals who've been in the White House. So Steve Bannon kept it simple. He's gone on interviews and even pointed all this out. He said, I needed a simple phrase and I needed for him to keep saying it over and over. And that's when Steve Miller, by the way, there's a great book out about him right now, interviewed the author. The author was interviewed on NPR. It's called Hate Monger. But Steve Miller and Steve Bannon came up with build that wall. And when Donald Trump went out to different rallies, it worked. It was a global phenomenon because in the UK at the same time, we were seeing the British leave the EU, Brexit. And in places like France, Marie Le Pen, who is basically a fascist, she's very, to the right of Genghis Khan, her party was getting more votes. And there's a rising movement throughout Europe, in Italy, in Poland, in Hungary. Oh my God, in Hungary, in Turkey, in country after country. And the two who have held out in Europe are Macron and Angela Merkel, while the rest of the continent was playing to a big part of their masses who were angry, disgusted with refugees, migrants. They're taking our jobs. They're lowering our income, our wages. And yet, even when they said things like that, and I know because my last trip to Italy, I actually visited some of my relatives who were kind of apologetic that they did their shopping at a local place. This is Sorrento, Italy, one of the most beautiful places on earth. And they had shops which were run by Chinese business people. And so even while the Italians lamented, oh my God, what has happened to the beautiful Italian nature of Italy? They were going shopping at the Chinese storefronts. They had welcomed hundreds of thousands of Chinese immigrants. And we were seeing a wave. In the United States, colleges saw the Chinese students coming here as cash cows. At Carnegie Mellon, which charges $80,000 a year in tuition and room and board. God bless them, Andrew Carnegie. He is getting his wish of capitalism. But they used to charge $95,000 to international students. So if you were coming from China, you were ponying up $95,000 to go to CMU, and there were thousands who were coming from China to CMU, to MIT, to Stanford, to Harvard. And suddenly, a few years ago, some said maybe this is causing some problems because we're seeing Chinese students basically tapping into this reserve of brilliance at these institutions and sending it back to China. Some of it very legit. That's what they're there, taking classes, learning all this. Other times, they were getting into computer systems and doing things which absolutely were cyber attacks. So we continue to see this, the pros and cons of globalization, and there were both. But there's unanimous consensus on the negative economic impact of the coronavirus. Now, that's in the short term. That's also in the medium term. It's going to take years, at least 2 to 3 years to recover. That doesn't mean that there can't be a fast recovery. If consumer spending goes wild, if at some point by next year in the spring, there's a vaccine, if we get it under control, I think there's going to be giant consumer spending, which can actually speed the process. But keep in mind, folks, this has done enormous damage short term. Going into medium term, tourism, countries like Italy and Spain, Israel, has been hurt so badly by the lack of tourism. And then you throw into it also, it's highlighted the dependence on China for supplies, and American companies. This is what's amazing. Companies like Apple and other American companies had this down to a science. They would get the supplies from China in a nick of time. The supplies would come in within a day or two, go right into the product. If something happened to the supply line and they didn't come in a day or two, oh my God, we can't build our phones. Because remember, we have this boom in technology, but also this outsourcing of even the technology parts. I mean, it's amazing. Microchips. We invented the microchip. We created it. And then, you know what? It's cheaper if we just let these microchips get developed in Asia. So then we can just have the microchips sent back. Boom, we put them into the phone. The same thing was happening with car parts. It was astounding. So there's no doubt folks, that short term, medium term, again, long term, anybody's guess. There will be pro and con. Are we going to learn the lessons of globalization? Are governments going to respond to the anger? Well, governments responded in some cases with protectionism and trade battles. There's a big question on protectionism. Does that really protect the American companies and consumers, or does that simply hurt our exports? In history, every time we tried protectionism on a massive scale, it came back to bite us. However, being used as a tool, again, this is why international negotiations are so important. Being used as a tool, it can be very effective so we don't get taken advantage of in deals where in the past, Japan in the 80s, China the last 20 years have dumped into our market. We know. By the way, other countries have dumped into our market too. We're the best market in the world. If you want to sell crap, where do you sell it? Here. We love the crap. We love it. Sell it to us. Think about all the tchotchkes you have in your house. What do they say? Made in fill in the blank. Probably China. I always wonder what those people on the assembly lines are thinking when they're making some of these things. Do you think at some point a couple of them just say, wow, who would be stupid enough to buy this crap? But anyway, we've seen that increase over and over. What we've seen is globalization causing the reaction, globalization causing the anger, which President Trump tapped into. And suddenly, globalization became part of his message. America first. We don't care. We're going it alone. And some applauded him, saying, well, he's looking out for us. He's looking out for our interests. He's not going to be taken advantage of by China and other countries. Yeah, that sounds good. But when you pull out of the Paris Climate Agreement, when you pull out of the TPP, the Iran deal, the UN Human Rights Council, recently the World Trade Organization, the United States is taking a step back. You'll hear a lot more about this when the ambassador speaks next week. But folks, this is what we see. The Republican Party was the party of trade. It was the party of investing around the world. The biggest supporters who embraced globalization was the Republican Party. And in the 1990s, Bill Clinton, a centrist Democrat who was loved by Wall Street because the economy suddenly took off with all the technology and innovation and inventions, he also embraced globalization. And the Republican Party that used to want to keep our allies, and saw the US as a global leader because they believe it's in the national interest of the United States to be a global leader, that isolationism actually hurts us. That's why so many conservatives in the foreign policy establishment in the Republican Party, let me give you a few names: John McCain, Robert Gates. The next two worked for Trump: H.R. McMaster, James Mathis. That's why they viewed Trump as wanting to rewrite the rules, but not in U.S. favor. And he doesn't measure U.S. influence in the world as the leading indicator of American power around the world. And what I'm sure you're going to hear next week, not to steal the ambassador's thunder, is that these moves have made our allies question us. They've made countries that were sort of always on the fence, but would cooperate with the United States, question us. Our role in the Middle East up until a few days ago, when I'm going to argue later on, the UAE's choice is no big surprise. It was just a question of when. Last year, I came at the invitation of Rabbi Alex and Neil, and I spoke about Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Bahrain, UAE, Oman. They're tired of having conflict with Israel. They don't understand. It's not helping them. but they would like more technology from Israel. They would like to invest in Israel. And the economic reasons for increasing the ties made too much sense. Plus, they hated Iran. They were afraid of Iran. And here's Israel, a powerful country we join with, and we isolate Iran. And so I'll save that for a little later. But it was a smart move. I don't know that Jared Kushner suddenly has become George Kennan, but he definitely, stumbled into this. And I'll get into how he got lucky, because his plan was read and basically rejected outright by some of the Arab countries who said, listen, we have a different idea. We'd like, and all of a sudden, Israel, these Gulf Arab countries said, why don't we sit down, see if we can work this out within 3 months. And folks, the dominoes are going to start to fall. UAE is the first. Again, it's just a question of time. Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Oman, Bahrain, they have no conflict with Israel. Now, what the Palestinians were hoping for was that was the ace in the hole. Recognition, peace, and economic and diplomatic ties in exchange for Netanyahu deciding to drop any more annexation and come to the table and finally agree to a 70%, 30% split. And so, the Palestinians reacted how we thought they were going to react. They're angry. But at the same time, it might draw Mahmoud Abbas to the table to negotiate. It might be pressure on him to negotiate. And, well, I might as well give this now. I'm way into it. Think about, for Netanyahu, why this became such a big deal. He needs the center. He needs the center right. He wasn't getting the support of the settlers and the far right the way he wanted, because they expected annexation to take place by now. And Thomas Friedman's piece is brilliant in the New York Times. Folks, go to the New York Times. It's called A Geopolitical Earthquake. And once again, Friedman on the Middle East, wow. He knows everybody there. Israeli journalists, Arab journalists. He has sat down with emirs and given them his plan. And I mean, yeah, on the Middle East, there's no better than Thomas Friedman. He called it a geopolitical earthquake, but he said this was for Benjamin Netanyahu the same as Nixon going to China. And he says Nixon was dealing with Watergate when he went to China, and Netanyahu has his own gate with all the corruption stuff in the trial. And so this made sense, and it was a very good deal for Israel, especially if it leads to recognition, diplomatic ties, economic ties. The key, if you are Palestinian and some of these Arab countries, is will the annexation continue at some point? Is this just a temporary hold? Or is this actually going to be more than just temporary? And again, maybe the other countries in negotiations will come to the table and that can be worked out. Folks, this is what is so amazing, that globalization has economic, social, political ramifications. But keep in mind that the real international problems we can't get international cooperation on: climate change and pandemics. The two areas where you need international cooperation more than any other areas, except for maybe avoiding a world war: pandemic, climate change. You want to talk about you need a global response? Countries can't just be nationalistic and say America first, Germany first, Japan first, China first. If ever there were two issues that would cause countries to just get rid of all the baggage, all of their national interest, all their parochial and divisive things, where everybody would benefit, it's climate change and not having another pandemic. Instead, look at what is happening. There has been immense cooperation on the private level between scientists at universities all over the world. But if some nation finds a breakthrough, are they going to share it with others? It doesn't look like that. It looks like there's a race, or maybe they'll be very selective. Maybe we'll see a quid pro quo. You've got to pay us so much. Maybe meetings have to happen at golf courses, whatever. So all of a sudden, we're seeing COVID-19 and climate change needing global response. And we pulled out of the Paris climate deal. We pulled out of the World Health Organization, which had a lot of warts. It wasn't a great organization, but fix it. We dumped it. We said to hell with it. We don't need to be in the World Health Organization. We don't need to be in the Paris climate deal. What message does that send? What message does that send? We're going to go it alone. We know better. We know better. My wife, my wife gave me as a Father's Day gift a book called Trump, a Stable Genius, because he's referred to himself as that. It was the worst Father's Day gift I think I've ever gotten. And if she really loved me, she would have given me some hilarious biography of Mel Brooks. But instead, my high anxiety came when I read A Stable Genius. And there are countless stories about, a president who's decided he knows better. He doesn't need to read the intelligence briefings. He wants people to come and talk to him and put it on a note card. Not 3 or 4 typed pages of notes. This drove H.R. McMaster's crazy, who was used to, when he was in the military, either preparing or asking from his staff 8 to 10 pages. He wanted to know everything about an issue. He was a general who was amazing. Did I just hit a wrong button? Okay, sorry. If I did, Neil, just let me know. That's what you get for chopping at your keyboard. But I'm Italian. If you put my hands behind me.
Perfect. You're perfect.
All right, thank you. I'm Italian. If you take my hands away, I can't speak. But anyway, this is what's crazy. What we're seeing is also so many polarizing things happening in our country because of globalization, because of the increase between the haves and the have-nots, the gap between the haves and the have-nots. And so what we see is the technology of globalization. All of a sudden, cell phones have made everybody a reporter with a camera, with a movie camera, with the ability to videotape everywhere. And that can be a wonderful thing, because you can't sweep what happened to George Floyd under the rug. And if anything, what we've seen in 10 years has both caused protests and demands for better life around the world. It caused the Arab Spring, Hong Kong, and racial injustice, police brutality became gigantic issues the last 6 months. Why? Because of technology. A tipping point was reached. Another great book by Malcolm Gladwell, The Tipping Point. I'm going to throw out about 5 books. Hopefully, Rabbi Alex will buy them for the library, or maybe I'll donate them, Alex, because some of them are so good. So now we move to, again, more of the social causes. Folks, some of the big social effects, let's see. Globalization is the movement of ideas, the movement of products, technology. It's the movement of people. The fast movement of ideas, technology, information, people. And that has been both good and bad. And now what we see is a global phenomenon of anger against refugees and immigrants, blaming them for problems, everything you can imagine within a country. And it's happened in Europe. It's happened in the US. And folks, it is growing. It's not getting less. You're going to hear Trump in this campaign beating the drum again of those refugees, those immigrants, and what they do to our country and the threats. And we have prevented them. I just need the chance to complete the wall. Well, the tourism around the world is big money. It's big money movement of people. And even in sports, think about it. The cancellation of the Tokyo Games, the cancellation of major sporting events that generate billions of dollars around the world. And think about the domino effect when you cancel the Olympics, when you cancel the NCAA tournament, when you cancel the Pac-12 and the Big Ten football schedule, how much revenue that costs. And really, the only sports that have not taken a major hit here in Pittsburgh are the Pirates. Because when you look out and see all the empty seats, it just makes you feel like you're watching them the last 5 to 10 years. But all these variables, my friends, all of these variables show how dependent we became on globalization. It was a lifeblood to many industries. Will the airlines industry bounce back? I don't know. Long term? Yeah. But with less flights, with less employees, what about robotics and technology? Could they possibly replace assembly line workers in places like China? Who knows? And keep in mind, folks, it wasn't those immigrants that stole so many of the jobs. This is what makes me laugh. If you're going to have a genuine debate, have a genuine debate. Pro and con, back and forth. You can do that with globalization. There's so much. But the debate is not that immigrants stole our jobs. Immigrants are the reason why we can buy lettuce and strawberries and fruits and vegetables, because they broke their backs in the fields. Oh, and by the way, we learned in Corona, they also broke their backs in some of these meat packing plants where they were very close to each other, and the company didn't care if they were 6 feet apart. Company wasn't too worried if they were keeping and adhering to strict guidelines and on masks. What happened? Next to nursing homes, those became the centers of Corona. They didn't take our jobs, folks. But what technology did was allow companies to go to other nations, to invest in China, other Asian countries. Now it's a question of, is China pricing itself out? Have they caused some distrust? Are countries justifiably angry at China? Is the turn to Vietnam? Is the turn to Cambodia? We don't know. It certainly is moving in that direction. And boy, the Chinese have become very smart with Xi's strategy of one belt, one road all over the world, putting his tentacles in so many countries. And now what scares the hell out of me is his relationship with Iran. The Iranians are so desperate that they sought out China, but it wasn't until months and months of negotiations, because China wants basically control of a lot of Iranian oil and Iranian petroleum infrastructure. And China they had the cards. They kept saying, look, you're getting crushed by sanctions. You're not exporting as much. The price of oil is way down thanks to Russia and Saudi Arabia battling. Hey, Iran, you're not making that much off of oil. We're the only game in town. The U.S. will keep squeezing you, but you can squeeze them back. You can ally with us. We'll help you the same way we helped Venezuela and the same way we've worked with North Korea. It's a bargain with the devil, because China's very tough, as they should be, on these negotiations. And if countries are desperate for their money and their infrastructure projects and all the rest, China's going to get a really good deal. And so this thing called the One Belt, One Road Initiative shows China moving into Europe, across Asia, across Central Asia, into Africa, Venezuela. I mean, folks, as the US is backing off the world and wants no part of so many of these places, we've basically given China the greatest entree to all of these different countries. So when we have this wonderful topic in front of us, it's fascinating. It is fascinating because it has so many different parts: social, economic, political. Let me put it in this order: ESP, economic, social, political. I don't have ESP to look into the future, but I always use ESP as a framework to kind of break down and analyze what is happening in many of these places. So in all of these areas, where else do we see the long hand of globalization? Let me just quickly run through a couple points and then we'll open it up to questions. Well, we're seeing foreign nations meddling in elections, mainly the Russians. We saw it in 2016. We're seeing it again in 2000. And I have to laugh. Let me see if I can find Trump's newest intelligence director admitted, oh yeah, the Russians are definitely showing signs of wanting to meddle in this election. But then he followed it up with, but China would like Joe Biden to win. So we're seeing some movement of China trying to hack in and meddle in the election. And I wanted to ask him, is this a false equivalency? Or is China at the same level as Russia? Because nobody's been as good at being the trolls as the Russians. I don't think the Chinese have been trolls on political stuff. They hack into American companies, into American universities to steal trade stuff, to steal technology. It's one of the ways that they got 5G before we did. But China never cared about the elections. They figured Republican, Democrat, they were going to basically trade and have negotiations regardless. This is the first time we're hearing that China maybe would like to see a candidate win because of the hostility. But it's not the same, folks. And when there are commercials, and you'll see them, Joe Biden is a tool of Xi Jinping. Folks, I'm sorry, but the counter commercial should be Vladimir Putin's largest tool in his toolbox has been Donald Trump. Because they're close. Because the Russians, even though they never admit it, they always will deny it. In 2016, now in 2020, I have to share quickly. People in Estonia, that tiny little country of Estonia that used to be in the USSR, they have formed something called the Nerd Patrol. I love that. They didn't give it a special name, counter co-insurgency technology and training. No, they're the Nerd Patrol. They love that. And so do I. What they've done is they've gone around the country to the best tech minds in Estonia with consulting from some other countries, and they have formed a defense against Russian hacking. Because the Russians last year were trying to hack into Estonia's election because they thought one of the candidates for president was going to be much more favorable to Vladimir Putin than the other. And they set up this Nerd Patrol of hundreds of brilliant tech people who would monitor all the time. And they would suddenly put up red flags when they saw the Russians trying to do something. They used the private sector, partnership between the public and private sector. Now, we have a gigantic intelligence community. And folks, they're pretty good. I know Trump loves to bash them. People love to bash them. But folks, and really, when they make a bad mistake, that's when you hear about it. It's like a referee of a football game. When they blow a call, everybody knows that ref blew that call. But the intelligence community, since 9/11, has done some extraordinary work. And one of the benefits of teaching amazing students, and in a few years, Miles, you're going to be on this list of students I'm going to network. But years ago, two of my students that graduated, one of them went into the State Department as a Foreign Service officer, and the other went into the CIA. And every year, once a year, we have coffee. I joke around. I don't want any, special intel, any info. And my friend from the CIA has a wonderful sense of humor. He said, "Oh yeah, I came prepared. I'm going to be giving you some documents at this meeting. We're going to have a real discussion." But he did tell me things which I found fascinating about the Russians hacking. He said, look, the hackers are the Russians, they're the North Koreans, they're the Iranians. The Chinese are worried about the bottom line, beating the United States in technology and managing to take technology secrets and know-how and use it to surpass the United States around the world. And I found that fascinating. China went from a poor nation to a global superpower in 30 years. That's unbelievable. That's just unprecedented in modern history. Why? Because they used access to foreign markets and partnerships with US and European and Japanese companies. They were cheap, enormous labor supply, and no unions in sight. So, what I would like to do for a moment, if everybody will excuse me for 1 second. Miles, this is going to bring back memories. I'm going to try and set up my whiteboard here. And the whiteboard is an amazing thing. Back when I was in my 20s, I met a wonderful economics professor. His name was Kurt Rethwish. His nickname was Deathwish because he was so hard. But he taught me something I'll never forget. And he taught me about a triangle. Let me just draw this triangle. And this is true for you, folks. It's true for companies. It's true for countries. The triangle has 3 parts. The top of the triangle, one of the points is fast. Another bottom point is cheap. And finally, the other part of the trio is good. I'm going to try and bring this around so you can see it. That's what it looks like. Ah, that's terrible. Okay. That's probably not working too good. Can you see that at all, Rabbi Alex?
So we could see the top says fast. Here it goes. The bottom says good. We're going to guess. And then the other side, you got to move it to your there. Cheap.
Yeah.
Good. Fast, good, cheap. Triangle. We got it.
That's my use of technique as far as wonderful graphics. Yeah. The idea of that triangle, folks, that triangle is, can you get things from other countries cheap? How long does it take? And how good is it? And here's my lesson to everyone. I'm sure all of you know it. If you ever find all 3 of those things, it's not too expensive, it's decent quality, and you can get it pretty quickly, jump in. If you can get 2 of the 3, usually you have won, sacrificing one of the 3. I mean, if you can get something pretty quickly, decent price, maybe you compromise a little on quality. You know, it's amazing. Walmart used that triangle and they made an entire industry. And Amazon used that triangle. Amazon has used that triangle to perfection. What Jeff has done is figured out how to provide things fast. If you've got Prime, we know how fast you can get things. Amazon allows you to shop around for a decent price, and because it's so huge, usually they do have better prices than some other websites. And it's pretty good. They offer a variety of different quality levels. So, folks, those are the things I wanted to talk about tonight. Those are the key points I wanted to bring up. I am happy to let Rabbi Alex, Neil,
Yep,
Miles.
we got questions for you.
Sure.
Here we go. You ready?
Sure.
Okay, I don't even know what it is. So you're gonna have to explain it. What should we do, if anything, with regard to TPP? I did look it up while you were talking.
Yeah. The TPP was the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And I'm going to argue that and the Paris Climate Agreement were the two most colossal blunders that Trump did. The TPP was worked out by Obama, and that's why Trump left it. It was a great partnership, economic partnership, alliance against China. It was the United States, Brazil, Canada, and many Asian countries forming this group, no China, and basically they were going to trade with each other because suddenly they felt like they were going to be economically very strong with the US as the central country. Just so everybody understands, one of the trade issues that Trump tried to go back on was the TPP. Last year, he asked his advisors, do you think I could just rename it and get those countries back to the table? And they said, oh no, those countries have gone ahead without us. That train has left the station. And so the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was going to be a boom for the United States. I mean, folks, this was like a trade deal with 12 countries who were going to buy US, not China, buy more US, less Chinese. We were going to buy more from them, less Chinese. We left and we had created the deal. Can you imagine? We had come up, we invented the terms, we came up with the TPP. It was going to be a coup. And again, President Obama had worked it out, and Donald Trump said, I'm not having it. I mean, he even renamed NAFTA, which is not dramatically different under the USMC, United States, Mexico, Canada agreement. But he had in his mind, all of his life, he had to put his brand, his imprint, had to be Trump. And he's not going to deal with Obama getting credit if the TPP is successful. Sad.
Okay, number 2. What's the likelihood of the return of big time manufacturing to our country? We always want you to be Nostradamus. You were right about the UAE. What is the likelihood of the return of big time manufacturing to our country?
I don't think big time manufacturing. I think middle and small manufacturing. You still have the big time manufacturing being auto industry, and you still have small manufacturing being companies that dot the whole country. The question is, as much as we complain about, getting these things from China or Vietnam or Indonesia, how much would it cost and would consumers pay if we made it here? And that's why American and Italian and French and German and Japanese don't just decide we're going to go local, because they instead saw where they had a comparative advantage, where they could do things better than others. Big time manufacturing, I think it's always going to play a part in the US. Manufacturing is not going to just go away. I've seen the obituary for manufacturing. That's not going to happen, but it's going to contort. It's going to get smaller. I mean, I love the Giant Eagle as an example. There was a few years ago, I listened to a lecture about automation is going to replace everybody's job. And I go to the Giant Eagle and I see the number of people waiting in line with a cart full, and I see the people who use the self-serve. And the self-serve is usually, if you have a few items, there's a line of 2, 3, but still all those people will wait in line for a cashier. And I know this is Seinfeld-esque, but I always believe that somehow I'm going to be George Costanza, screw up going through the self-serve. All of a sudden, lights are going to go off, alarm bells, And people are going to just look and go, oh my God, what an idiot. So instead, I go through the regular line. And that's the thing. If you're talking about service industry, the technology hasn't replaced so many people. The manufacturing industry did get hit by technology, by robotics, and it will continue. But my simple answer is don't write the obituary, but definitely it won't be as healthy as it was. It will stay at the level it is on life support, and who knows?
Okay, here we go. A couple of your students, our previous students, other than Miles, have asked some questions. Here's one. What do you think about Trump's recent restrictions on trade with China, Uyghurs, I don't know how to pronounce it, and additions to the entities list?
The Uyghurs.
Uyghurs, thank you. I've heard of that.
Yeah, the Uyghurs of
Just think I'd
northern
spell
China.
it.
And I think part of their problem is nobody can spell them.
I can't spell it.
I know. I'm glad that you said, okay, we have an old student who starts his message, you fat bastard, why did you give me a B in international relations?
These are good students who are the ones who are writing. They're good students.
So, no, but Alex, in China, for many, many years, this story was buried. Again, because of globalization, because of cell phone technology, we're seeing pictures, we're seeing video, we're getting stories out of Northwest China about hundreds of thousands of people being sent to in education camps. Yeah, they used to call those labor camps. And sadly, a recent story 2 weeks ago was about the Uyghurs being forced to make masks for export by China to many countries around the world. They're hated by the Chinese. They're hated because they're Muslim, because they prefer to speak their own language instead of Mandarin. And the Chinese are going to continue to hammer them. This is another Tibet. They're not going to allow them to get up off the ground. And if the world wasn't watching, they would be even more brutal. And if the media wasn't doing stories on this, I'm sure, I mean, I don't know how much worse it can get. They're putting hundreds of thousands of people into these camps. You know, there are some who disappear and never return. But at least around the world now, we know a little bit more about this. The question is, do countries care? Will nations make it an issue? And what's really sad is that when Mike Pompeo, Secretary of State, brought up the situation in Hong Kong and tried to say to the Chinese that they were taking away rights and were brutal, the Chinese ambassador to the US responded with, I can't breathe. Ouch. So that's also an issue, and we lost a little bit of the high moral ground.
Okay. I've got a note and a question for you from the same another student who may be related to the person bringing this thing together, but not my student, Neil's student. First one is, I should just note that the other 11 TPP countries held up the agreement without the United States. He thought that was a great little note to it. And a question. The question is, what is preventing free trade among the free nations, even under Obama? Why can't Europe, Japan, the US, Canada get together and form the greatest trade bloc in the world?
Because of the forces of populism and nationalism and xenophobia. And because if any of the leaders of those countries publicly embrace that, which makes a lot of sense, it makes a ton of sense. Think about the political ramifications. What would happen? Would a candidate be able to win in any of those countries if seen as a true internationalist, embracing globalism at this particular time? That doesn't mean something down the road can't happen. It just means that right now, with everything so raw and with anger, coming out from the US against China, with the venom against immigrants and refugees throughout Europe, in the United States, The only reason it doesn't happen in Japan is because they're 99.91% Japanese. So those are the reasons. It's political, it's domestic political issues, and election issues.
Okay, here's another one. Now, this is another one of your Nostradamus moments. When will Saudi Arabia recognize Israel?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that it's going to happen within the next year. I think that the Saudis, again, they know that it makes a lot of sense to be allied with Israel. They know that Iran threatens them. Israel doesn't. What they have to worry about, though, is if they do an Anwar Sadat moment, then will there be upheaval inside the country? Will the population have huge negatives? And up until now, that's been the reason. It's been happening, folks, behind the scenes. Israel and Saudi Arabia, Israel and Kuwait, UAE, they've been cooperating for years. They've been sharing intelligence against Iran. They've been sharing technology against Iran. Why? Because Iran represents the extremists. And they not only vow to fight on and destroy Israel, but they would love to destroy the House of Saud in Saudi Arabia, the emirs in Kuwait. And so the common enemy has united the other countries. There are two clear camps in the Middle East, folks. Iran has scared the hell out of countries like Saudi Arabia and Kuwait and UAE and Israel because basically they have huge influence in Iraq. I would argue today Iraq is under Iranian control in many ways. They've had huge influence in Syria. So if you're looking at the unholy trinity of Syria, Iran, and Iraq, and maybe Yemen, but you're going to quickly draw who you can as allies together and show Iran that it's a formidable force. And the United States is still, despite walking away, from the preeminent role in the Middle East, the United States still plays a part. The United States, in many ways, can still be that bridge between Israel and Saudi Arabia, and it was a bridge between the UAE and Israel. So I expect it the next year. I expect that we're going to see if negotiations are successful, because I don't think Saudi Arabia wants to do this by themselves. I think the Saudis are waiting when they can say, hey, Kuwait, Oman, even Sudan, those countries are anxious to speed up negotiations with Israel, which is incredible.
Okay, now I have one last question from the audience, but it's such a depressing question. I have then my goal for you is then my charge to you is after this question you have to end on a positive note. So the question is, how similar is this to Germany in the 1930s? Which is, yeah, if you answer anything that's depressing, you're gonna have to. Jewish law says you must end on a positive note. So,
this is not going to be a depressing answer.
Oh, okay, then go ahead. Then you knock off two birds with one stone.
Okay, there's a depressing part, and that is Germany, Austria, Poland, Hungary. They have a right-wing fringe movement, but they also have an incredibly strong center and left. The difference is in the 1930s, you had economic calamity, and the other movements could not really combat the Nazis, even though the Nazis could only get 31, 32% in elections. But, the Nazis figured out how to increase that number once people were seeing them take over. And of course, they fell in line. And the whole frightening aspect today is we do see the rise of the right. We do see a rise of neo-Nazis. And yet we also see a big portion of those countries, Germany especially, where Angela Merkel has kept things together. God bless her. She's retiring in a year or two. But the center left in Germany is incredibly stable and strong. And part of that has been recognizing that Angela Merkel was the leader of Europe, along with Macron in France. She basically kept the EU together. And I think the Germans, I mean, here's my hope. They have to take a year-long class in high school on the Holocaust. Every single student. It's not stopping a movement over there. But hell, folks, we've got movements over here. The nut jobs are nut jobs in those countries, in this country. The question is fighting the nut jobs, combating the nut jobs, putting a light on this. And it used to be when you put a light on it, they would scramble like cockroaches. But now, if you put a light on anti-Semitic, on rabid right, extremist right, they actually have forums, whether it's Breitbart, some of the shows on Fox, they have a base that can extend out. I'm not saying Fox and Breitbart are the neo-Nazi or, right-wing anti-Semitic. I'm talking about those other fringe groups. And folks, if you want to check who those are, go to the Southern Poverty Law Center, because they give you a list of all of these groups. But then again, I think, holy cow, QAnon or Quanon, I don't know how to, it's QAnon. I don't know the right way to pronounce it. These people are just lunatics. And there's a lady in Georgia. She's become the Republican nominee for one of the seats in Congress in the House of Representatives, and she's an avid QAnon follower. Oi, I mean, the fact that these people, they're trying to move more and more to mainstream. This is what scares me, Alex. They're trying to move more and more to the mainstream. When I see a rally from Trump, hey, it's political participation. Hey, that's great. For Biden, Trump, there will be rallies. But when I see signs with Q on them, holy Shiite, it's like a radical Islamic group came to a rally or any other extremist group and held up a sign. Except these people were in the weeds, and they were the masterful folks who came up with the theory that Hillary Clinton was part of the international sex trafficking network, and the pizza shop in Washington, D.C. was the hub. That was the center. They also said John F. Kennedy Jr. faked his death. He was going to come back and join Trump as his vice presidential new candidate. Well, I am waiting to see that happen. Wow. So I'm going to end on this note. We have survived, the United States as a country, 2 world wars, the Cold War, so 3 wars. We've overcome Vietnam and Watergate. We have overcome 9/11. We bounced back. It took years, but the 2008 financial collapse. And each time the United States has been in a situation where it has been forced to wake up because of a crisis, it has done so. And whether Republican or Democrat, I hope that there's a majority of people who are sensible, who understand that these are perilous times. And in some ways, we will survive this. We will, as we have, survive another crisis, but we also have to get smart. We have to learn the lessons of this pandemic, Alex. We have to make sure that this doesn't happen again. And I hope and pray every night that leaders around the world understand you have to share medical knowledge and information. And the Russians jumping ahead without really testing. Wow, that's dangerous. Most countries are going to test extensively. I hope that we see many nations cooperating and realizing that unless we have cooperation and a global response, the next time this happens, we'll be right back to square one. But since we have learned from past disasters, I hope we learn lessons once again, and I'm confident that we will.
As we say in our services, Yasher Koach, which means may your strength be upright. You did a great job. Neil, do you want to give out any last minute announcements before I unmute everyone and gallery view so everyone can give a big hand to our speaker tonight?
Thanks everybody for showing up. Looking forward to seeing you next Monday. George, thanks for joining us. And thank you everybody from Pittsburgh, Phoenix, and Sanibel Island. You didn't know, George, you have an international following now.
Well, it was global.
Thanks again. Take care, everybody.
Okay, we're unmuting everyone for a big hand. Yay!
Thanks, George.
Thank you.
very
Thank you,
much.
George.
Excellent. Excellent again.
Thank you. I'll open up the chat as well. Bye.
Oh, it's time to watch the Democratic convention.
It is, that's right.
Beautiful. You guys are
Fantasy.
Neil.
Hi, y'all.
I gotta watch Michelle speak, so I'm saying goodbye.
Right.
Going on now?
Thanks, George.
Yes. It's starting now.